an event co-organized and co-sponsored by the Center for Human Rights Research and the Center for Social Science Research and Policy at the University of Manitoba. My name is Shayna Plout, and I am the director of the Center for Social Science Research and Policy, and I join you from my home office in Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. This event is many months in the making, but the unfolding events of the past week, the murders of 3 First Nation women and 1 unidentified woman, Mercedes Myron, Morgan Beatrice Harris, Rebecca Contois, and Buffalo Woman, and the Winnipeg Police's refusal to ensure their remains are brought home to their families has rightly reshaped the focus of this event. We also recognize that on Monday, Kayla Ray of North Spirit Lake First Nation died in a bus shack in St. Boniface because of a lack of shelter in one of the richest countries in the world. These grave human rights violations has reshaped how we must talk about human rights at this time and in this place called Winnipeg. Here's some information about where we can go if you need support. Where we can go to learn more, and if we can financially do so, where we can go to donate in order to continue to fight to end the ongoing human rights crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people. We want to ensure that you are aware that this event is being recorded and will be shared on the websites of both centers. We also have graphic recorder Erica Bota from ThinkLink, who is present with us today. We are raw right now. We are shaken right now. To be honest, we were not sure if we should go forward with this event, but we were encouraged to do so because of the resolve of people in Winnipeg, including the families of the women who are murdered and missing and who want to be brought home. Because of the strength to speak truth to power and to demand justice from Indigenous women who are standing with the families, Indigenous women like MP for Winnipeg Centre, Leah Gazan, who is the critic for women and gender equality and the critic for children, families, and social development. And we are honored to have Leah, who has literally been fighting day and night, open up today's discussion with some reflections.
I've been asked to give a statement about what the PEG would look like as a human rights city at a time where I was at the House of Commons late at night in debate to immediately put a moratorium on the Garden Prairie landfill to stop putting refuge on our stolen sisters that the police have indicated believe is in this landfill. In what world, in what human rights city, in what world do we accept throwing trash on the human remains of loved ones? A debate that occurred yesterday when I found out another woman froze to death in a bus shack. We are at a critical juncture in this city, and we all need to come together and really lend our voice to ensure that the PEG can be a human rights city. And that means ensuring the right to housing. And that means ensuring the right to safety. And that means that we treat people with equal value with putting in place things like a red dress alert, a guaranteed livable basic income, something that I'm proposing in Bill 223. We have a long way to go in Winnipeg to ensure we're a human rights city. So I'm asking you to join in this call to action, to lift up the families of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people at this time, and fight for human rights for all. It is time.
And we want to note that Leah made this video 2 days, yesterday morning, before the city and the province rightly decided to cease dumping trash in the Prairie Green landfill, where evidence suggests that the remains of Mercedes Myron and Morgan Beatrice Harris are located. The 10th of December is International Human Rights Day. It is supposed to be a day of celebration and hope, commemorating the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. It is hard to find celebration and hope right now, but as Leah reminded us, it is not hard to find resolve. It is not hard to find the fire to fight and demand justice. Throughout history, tragedies and injustice have been the catalyst for movements. The assault on school children in Soweto, South Africa, brought the world's attention to the violence of apartheid. The racist murder of teenager Trayvon Martin in Florida birthed the Black Lives Matter movement. And the body of 3-year-old Alan Kurdi washed ashore finally awoke the global north to the desperation of refugees attempting to seek safety. Here at home, it is clear that Winnipeg's relationship with human rights is one of dissonance. Winnipeg claims the identity of a human rights city, but it has also famously been labeled the most racist city in Canada. Winnipeg is one of the poorest cities in Canada, but it was also home to the 1919 Winnipeg strike that brought economic justice and labor rights to this country. Winnipeg is ground zero for murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited people, but it is also the urban epicenter of Idle No More. To be clear, we recognize that the language of human rights has been used and continues to be used to bolster the state at the expense of other forms of governance, nationhood, and movements. This is particularly clear in the relationship between Indigenous rights and claims to land, and the often homogenizing and individualized approach taken in the liberal, state-centered human rights tradition. There is no question that the narrow approach to human rights, as synonymous and limited to that of law, is both incorrect and highly problematic. In addition, up until recently, the law itself was used to justify human rights abuses against the very people who call this land home. At the same time, we also recognize the potential of human rights as a tool among many other tools to help people and peoples live a life of dignity, safety, and hope. We also recognize that the Human Rights City movement aims to bring the international human rights framework and instruments and moral cachet as a means of leverage to address local human rights abuses and aspirations, while also assuring that this is done within the context and the local strengths of our city, whatever that city may be. In this time, Winnipeg. So given that, we bring together a very diverse range of people who span from architecture to policy, anthropology to law to political science, the hyperlocal to the very international. In light, or maybe because of the dissonance between the identity and lived realities of human rights here in Winnipeg, we ask, what could Winnipeg look like as a human rights city? Before starting, I must acknowledge that this event would not have been possible without the strong management of Dr. Pauline Tennant, manager of the Center for Human Rights Research, and Dr. Adele Perry, director for the Center of Human Rights Research. I thank you both for your creativity, tenacity, leadership, and the consistency in modeling how academia can work for justice in a kind and very real way. Our guests today, we have 5, and I will read them brief bios in the order that they'll be speaking, and then I'll let them introduce themselves. Reanna Merasty is from Barren Lands First Nation. Reanna is currently an architectural intern at number 10 Architectural Group and is the chair of the Welcoming Winnipeg Committee. Reanna is also an artist and writer and co-founded the first Indigenous student-led organization in the Faculty of Architecture. Warren Clarke is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Manitoba and a nationally recognized consultant on anti-oppression, anti-racism, and equality, diversity, and inclusion work within institutions. Nathan Derejko is the Mauro Chair of Human Rights at the University of Manitoba, with an emphasis on human rights and international human rights law. Karen Sharma is the Executive Director of the Manitoba Human Rights Commission and the co-chair of the Women's Health Clinic. In addition, Karen helped establish the grassroots organization QPOC, Queer People of Color. And lastly, but not least, Joel Pruce is Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of Applied Research and Learning at the University of Dayton Human Rights Center. He works closely with the Human Rights Cities Alliance, a grassroots group of academics, activists, and lawyers in the United States and Canada that are working to bring international human rights frameworks to bear on a local city level. Recognizing that we have 5 people and a limited amount of time, we have crafted some questions that we hope will guide the discussion. We will ask each person to speak for 3 minutes. We also recognize that what each person says will most likely inspire thoughts between one another and the audience. So we'll be saving 10 to 15 minutes at the end for question and answer. We ask that you type your questions in the Q&A function, which is being moderated by Adele and Pauline. So, Reanna, what are you passionate about, and how do you bring that passion here to this discussion?
Thank you so much, Shana, for that introduction. So tanse sepikosu and askini esquero and disnakasin kisipakamak ntosin. My name is Reanna Merasty, and my spirit name is Blanket Woman. I am Woodlands Cree or Nihila Squirrel, a Woodlands Cree woman from Barren Lands First remote community in northern Manitoba. I also like to acknowledge the name Tawipisim, which means pathway to the sun, and it was a name that was stripped from my kugum when she attended residential schools. I would also like to say thank you to Nkananaskamitan and to Leah Gazan for her opening remarks. It has been a very heartbreaking and tough week, and this issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Two-Spirit is what I hold close in this conversation. And as Shana and Leah said, it is a very heavy last couple days as an Indigenous woman. So my passion stems from my identity, where I come from, but also my time in the field of architecture and design, where I have a drive to create spaces and places that rightfully reflect and honor Indigenous people. When I first moved to Winnipeg in 2013, when I started to attend the University of Manitoba, I experienced either the misrepresentation or lack thereof of Indigenous people in the city, and the exclusion of Indigenous people in the city. I also experienced the lack of resources as a young and Indigenous person moving to the city on their own and having to navigate various systems on their own. I experienced working with Indigenous youth in care and how they've been mistreated within the system. and also discriminated against in the child welfare system. I also realized when I first came here the dire need for houseless relatives on the street, and really felt for them and realized that there's a lot of resources and steps needed to provide them with sustenance and homes and resources that they rightfully deserve. And all of these experiences that I've had are really the foundation for my passion in creating spaces that firstly reflect Indigenous people, but also spaces that provide safety and security. And that's the key word that I want you to realize within this conversation, is the aspect of safety. And this theme that is rooted in my work in design, in welcoming Winnipeg, and advocacy and Indigenous education for young people is all to really achieve safety and security. We must create spaces that firstly provide comfort, confidence, and pride for Indigenous people. And within every conversation that I have, this underpinning theme of safety is something that is always reoccurring, and is something that I always try to work for within the work that I do, because it's really providing Indigenous people that safe space to thrive, to practice their culture, to have comfort, to have confidence within their voice, but also have pride in who they are as an Indigenous person. And for myself, it's all about creating those spaces and allowing them to thrive, and really being the foundation for what they do and whatever that they pursue. So I'll leave that there.
Many thanks, Reanna, and many thanks for bringing it back to the issue of safety, security, and pride. Warren, what are you passionate about?
Thank you very much for having me. Much appreciated. Shayna, much appreciated for the introduction. Panelists, my co-panelists, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate all of you and learning from all of you. But again, my name is Warren Clarke. My introduction was already given. I just started doing that, not sure why, but anyways, here we go. What's passionate about me? I'm very passionate about creating inroads to think through what solidarity means and how we can establish a sense of solidarity among all people. I appreciate that we at times look for the easiest way to identify people, but I think it's also important to recognize that we all have different lived experiences, and we come from different backgrounds, and that's pointing to intersectionality, as much as I'm saying it in other ways, is important. So I'm very passionate about how do we understand ourselves as human beings among other human beings, and understanding that we do face social oppressions differently. We do have and should be encouraged to be culturally competent to understand how we can understand people. So those are my passions, and that's what I bring to this conversation. Is how do we start to think through what human rights is, and inclusivity, not and appreciation that everyone should have and the ability to experience this city and their human rights be taken in consideration like anyone else. So that's what I bring to the table. I also want to acknowledge that the recent events with the horrific killings of Indigenous women is not by no means something that we should just talk over and leave it there. It is a conversation that we should definitely take in consideration how we can think through and how we can solve some of these horrific instances. It's really important. It is also important how we can think through and how we can heal from these moments, but educate folks on understanding that these are things that have been happening and they continue to happen, because this is not a one-off thing. This has been going on, and this is a social oppression that impacts everyone. Although I am not Indigenous, I say that with respect, but I am a human being, and it's important that we also understand that the tensions and the hurt that Indigenous peoples are experiencing daily, not only through murder, but access to housing, as has been mentioned, access to the right to live in a decent space is issues, and plus many more is important. So this is an opportunity for me myself to be culturally competent in this moment and learn, and trusting that my colleagues will do the same.
Many thanks, Warren. I think we're all here in order to learn and to share and to also figure out ways of how we can work with each other to move forward. And by each other, I mean including the over 92 people that we have right now who are joining us. Nathan.
Yes, hello. First, let me thank Shayna and Pauline for organizing this discussion, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for my co-participants. My passion really is in grassroots organizing. I come from a very much grassroots organizing background, all frequently on a broad range of issues, but evoking the concept of human rights or the language of human rights, but not really knowing what its content or scope was or how it could be used, often becoming frustrated over the lack of, let's say, success in things, which led me to do more studies and participating in different grassroots organizations or NGOs. And I think what my passion is now is building bridges between grassroots organizing and the concepts and principles of international human rights law, as well as between different organizations working on the same issues, but from a different perspective. So building bridges between academia and grassroots organizations, or international organizations and grassroots organizations, and kind of representing a diversity, or respecting a diversity of tactics in achieving collective common objectives. So I think that there's a lot of potential in sharing experiences and knowledge and approaches. And I just don't think that there's one single way to approach the types of issues that we're examining and experiencing here today. I am brand new to Winnipeg, so my experience of Winnipeg is quite limited to just a handful of months. So I have a lot of learning to do about the city, its history, the current struggles that are going on, and the current initiatives that are going on. But I am inspired by the progressive civil society in Winnipeg. It's probably the most inspiring thing about Winnipeg so far for me, and Manitoba. So it's an honor to be here today. And yeah, I think I would just leave it at that.
Many thanks, Nathan. And from being here for a few months to somebody who was born and bred in Winnipeg and knows grassroots organizing and systems very well. Karen, what are you passionate about?
Oh, thanks very much. I really struggled with answering this question, and it's funny sometimes how the simplest of questions can really catch you off balance. And maybe it's just sort of the daily grind of doing human rights work. It took me a minute to step back and remember what motivates me and what passion drives me in this work. But I thought maybe I'd just start by locating myself. So I was born here in Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg to parents and siblings of South Asian immigrants. So those are my roots in the world. And my family came here in and around the 1970s and has been in Winnipeg ever since their arrival in Canada. In terms of my work, since about 2015, I've been working here at the Manitoba Human Rights Commission, and in the past 3 years in the role of executive director. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with the commission, we are a statutory agency, so we're established by law to promote human rights principles and educate, develop policy, do research in the area of human rights, as well as administer a complaint process so people can come forward to us to talk about experiences of discrimination in the province of Manitoba. Aside from my work at the commission, I'm queer, and I'm really lucky to walk alongside and sort of follow in the footsteps of many incredible 2S QT BIPOC, so Two-Spirit, queer, trans, Black, Indigenous people of color, including my colleagues Uzoma Asagwara and Davy Cole, who together we've been organizing in the collective called Queer People of Color Winnipeg for a past number of years. It was actually founded by Uzoma Asagwara. And it's an organization or a collective that's really about making safe spaces, places where 2S QT BIPOC can feel safe and seen and celebrate and feel joyful in, you know, a broader queer community that can sometimes be hostile and unwelcoming to us. And so I've just been pulling on those themes of safety and organizing and solidarity that has sort of come through the passion that ignites us in this work. I'm also really lucky to work with folks at the Women's Health Clinic, and where I've been the board chair for the past 4 years, and we're at the clinic an organization that's really dedicated to ensuring people in Winnipeg and beyond have access to sexual, reproductive, and mental health care in the ways that they need, which includes the right to abortion health care, which, you know, we talked about a few months ago through the Center for Human Rights Research and the importance of ensuring and entrenching that right as well. So all of that is a bit of a background about the work that I do. But when I had to sort of think about what I'm passionate about, the first thing that came to mind for me was the thing I'm passionate about is being an auntie. And maybe that seems like a strange thing to say in this sort of forum. But being an auntie is really an ethic for me. It's a way I live my life, and it's an ethic that underpins all of my community work and my work in human rights. And why I talk about being an auntie and why it's important to me is because I don't think I would be in the world today if it wasn't for the aunties that helped support me and stood in for my parents when I needed care and celebration and joy and safety. And it wasn't just my biological aunties, it was really the queer aunties, some of them who I know and some who I don't, who made a community that I could find safety in. So for me, in the work that I do, what I feel passionate about is being an auntie and making sure that I, you know, strive on a daily basis to bring kind of auntie energy into the community work that I do, making space for others, supporting the myriad of ways people express themselves and live their lives, helping people find happiness and joy, and, you know, honoring and recognizing the things that people find joy in, even if they're different from what I find joy in, and what, you know, means a good life to me might be different to other people, but honoring and recognizing that. And I think that's so foundational to human rights work, essentially, and to doing good community work, is seeing and honoring each other and celebrating each other and making space for one another. And that's what I think maybe all of us can relate to, having aunties in our life that did that for us, that were just people that we could turn to, that were safe and honoring, and made us feel like the issues that were important to us were worth their time. So what I'm passionate about is doing community work, supporting my community, and being a good auntie to the members in my community.
Thank you very much, Karen. And thank you for reminding us that when we're talking about human rights, we're not just talking about human rights violations, but human rights possibility and the joy of human rights. I also want to acknowledge that Uzoma has joined us. So I know that they're only going to be able to be here for a little bit. They're coming in and out for many things, but I want to give that shout out. Thank you very much. Joel, I'm going to turn it over to you, and please, can you let us know what you're joyful, or pardon me, what you're passionate about?
Thank you, Shayna. With gratitude to Shayna for the invitation, and Pauline and others for the labor that it takes to put these things together. My participants, co-participants. So my name is Joel. I've been introduced. I teach and write at the University of Dayton in Ohio in the United States. And I think this is a nice segue, actually. I think I like when a plan comes together. I mean, I think a lot of us are speaking very much in the same tone. I'm passionate about people power. I'm passionate about building power with people. I'm passionate about dreaming and envisioning a future that we don't live in yet, but a future that's better than this one. And for me, you know, at all levels, right? Whether it's with my family, and I appreciate that grounding, regrounding for us, whether it's my family, my community, my students, my colleagues, you know, I increasingly want all of my effort and time to be spent toward building communities of power with others. And human rights for me is the way that I do that. I would say almost the way, but the way, as just an organizing framework for thinking about the future, for aspiring toward a better future, toward aspiring for a society that obviously centers dignity, checks on power, et cetera, and all those things. And, you know, I mean, increasingly, again, in my research and in my teaching and in my community work, you know, I want human rights. I work to implement and to make real the norms and ideas that are contained in international human rights law, in distant, arcane documents that are unfamiliar to many, that feel out of touch, that feel distant, that feel elite in a lot of ways, and how to make those real, you know, and I think that human rights become real by virtue of how we implement them in our collective work, how they structure our imagination, and how they allow us an opportunity to foreground lived experience in that vision, right, and in that dreaming. So my work with the Human Rights Cities Alliance that Shana mentioned, you know, an active movement in multiple cities in the United States and elsewhere, is one effort, and there are many others. And yeah, so for me, human rights is sort of a central thread, an organizing set of principles, for organizing, for shaping movements, for generating ideas that foreground people's experience and allow us to dream and build together. I'm grateful to be here today.
Many thanks, Joel. And many thanks again for bringing us to hope and aspiration. And that leads me to the next question, which is, how would you define what we mean by a human rights city? And Reanna, I'm wondering if I can go to you, where you really are grounded in place, all right, and space. So how would you define what we mean by a human rights city?
Well, first of all, for me, a human rights city means a city free from harm, discrimination, racism, and exclusion. And I truly think you can't talk about a human rights city without Indigenous people being at the forefront of that conversation. And with Winnipeg, and also with Winnipeg having one of the largest Indigenous populations in all of Canada. And I just want to start off this by, there was a point where I did not feel I could offer anything to this conversation. But with this recent news and this state of emergency for MMIWG2S, I knew it was important for me to position this conversation as an Indigenous woman within the city. So that's why I also moved forward with this conversation. And I know Shana offered that support as well, which I'm very grateful for. So first of all, I wanted to start off with this aspect of an experience as an Indigenous woman living within the city. And as an Indigenous woman, my father would always repeatedly say to stay safe. He always told me how to defend myself from a young age, to not have headphones in when I was walking by myself in the street at night, to always lock the doors almost immediately when I get inside my car, and to always constantly be aware, because he knew that there was a target on my back, and to make sure that I knew how to stay safe and how to protect myself. And I truly don't think that's a way to live, or a way that we should be walking about the city. And I get emotional because this is so close to me, because I used to work with youth in care and these young women who are going to be subject to a lot of these harms within the city and this crisis of MMIWG and Two-Spirit. And if I don't feel safe as an Indigenous woman, how does those that feel that are the most vulnerable or marginalized feel within the city? And it breaks my heart to know that many young Indigenous women are brought up in this life and are taught the same narrative, and may be subjected to this crisis. So when I think about a human rights city, it's a city where we no longer are seen as unworthy of safety and security, where we are no longer seen as insignificant, And a human rights city is where we are no longer have to reiterate and preface young Indigenous women that they are not safe. And all of this is also an experience of how we uplift the young Indigenous people within our community, the ones that are subject to the CFS system, the ones on the street, the ones that are subject to abuse or addictions. Like, how are we uplifting them so they don't have to be subject to another crisis like this? And so when I think about this human rights city, I think about that young people walking about these streets and not having to be reiterated or be acknowledged, like that they should be able to feel safe wherever they walk about these streets, and have those types of resources that provide them that type of safety and security. And I know that as an Indigenous woman and as an Indigenous person within the city, that this type of experience is not just my own, that it's many people that are within the city, and we should always be acknowledging and understanding of their experiences and working towards that type of betterment of our community.
Many thanks, Reanna. Warren, how would you define what we mean by a human rights city?
Sorry about that. Didn't have it on mute, off of mute. Reanna, thank you for your vulnerability. I want to acknowledge that. And I appreciate you. And I trust that when I talk, it's a way for inviting people for critical thinking and reflection. You know, when I think about a human rights city, and I also have to set the tone very similar to my colleague Nathan on this panel, is I've only been in Winnipeg for a year. And I'm still getting to know the lay of the land and how people move within this city. But one of the things that there is an opportunity for is to acknowledge people from different intersections of life. And I mentioned this in the beginning of my talk. I've come to know that, appreciating human life in this city is not one where we proactively take an opportunity to understand that people come from different social classes, we come from different races, we come from different ages, different characteristics. And this is not an opportunity for me to, lending from the words of my colleague, Dr. Kathleen Buttle, who is very intelligent. I think she should be on this panel as well. This is not my opportunity to then assert an Olympics of suffering. But I think it's important that when we think about Winnipeg, our Winnipeg population is growing. And it's also growing where it's inserting different people from different lived realities. And I think there's an opportunity to take those into consideration. I think there's an opportunity to take in consideration that, the killing of people is not only of Indigenous people. There are Black folk, African descent folk that are being murdered by the police, particularly in 2019. Machuar Madut was killed by the Winnipeg police. And a lot of people who I've asked in this city don't even know who that person is. Sorry about that. That was an email. And I think we have an opportunity to lean into those moments, and not to say one suffering is over the other, but to appreciate human life, and to also look through moments of how we can appreciate and solve these tensions that we're continuing to have. And I think when you ask me the question, how do we envision a human rights city? I think we have to be intentional with that. I think we also have to be intentional with the language we use to appreciate people. And this is not a shot of any of my colleagues in this panel, but I continue to hear BIPOC. I continue to hear POCs. I am a Black man, but I am not a POC. I'm not a BIPOC. I'm a person that has my own individuality, and a person that has more than just a Black man or a Black person. I think we need to lean into those moments, understanding that, if we can understand the person on the individuality level, then we can start to understand some of the tensions that these people are experiencing. So I push this conversation to, again, to invite dialogue, to encourage critical thinking, and not to lose sight of what is happening and what has happened in the past, but how we can also think through again, how do we appreciate these oppressions and move forward with recommendations that can help us solve these tensions.
Many thanks, Warren, and many thanks for calling us to also remember that we are individuals, but we're also living in systems and we're living in structures. Nathan, I know that you have spent a lot of time actually looking at some of the legislation regarding human rights cities. How would you define what we mean by a human rights city?
Yeah, I think for me, I think the idea or the vision that Reanna expressed about a safe, inclusive space where certain vulnerable categories of individuals aren't targets and they can, is the idea of what a human rights city should look like. But I guess for my question would be like, how do we get there to that space? What steps can we take as individuals, as collectives, as organizations, as communities? How can we work together to get there? And I think one of the things from my perspective, obviously, is looking at like a human rights city should mainstream and center human rights laws and policies and principles throughout its policies and municipal bylaws and all these things to make sure that it adopts kind of a human rights-based approach to its housing strategy, its education strategy, its urban planning strategy, its educational curriculums. Everything from healthcare to leisure should be kind of infused with what we call in human rights laws like a human rights-based approach, which is based on a bunch of things, but the two key ones are participatory. So all of these decisions, if Winnipeg wanted to develop an inclusive housing strategy, it would be based on participatory. Those that are most affected by the policy would be invited to participate in developing it. So we have a firsthand insight in what is actually needed versus what is desired at some other level. But two is that it's also transparency process, and taking it to a human rights-based approach would mean that housing is recognized as a human right rather than a commodity to be traded for money and these things. And once we recognize something as a right, it means that these certain services aren't benefits or schemes or services. They're actually legal rights, which means we should have guaranteed access to them, and the government should be held accountable for failing to provide those rights to us, right? So for me, it's one of multiple tools that can be used to leverage compliance or to leverage action transparency within the governance at the municipal level. Like usually human rights law is at that international level, that abstract, foreign, elitist, Western, all of those things. And then even when we nationalize it, it's at that national level. And it's not even translated here. But really, if we look at human rights in practice, they're almost always realized on the ground at the bottom up community level. And I think here is what tools and ideas and frameworks can guide our governance structures, our community structures, our power dynamics within, to build this idea of a human rights city, whatever it looks like. But it's not only, for me, it's not only in terms of like our housing strategy or our transportation or education, but it begins with like everything from our education, the national curriculum, or the Manitoba curriculum needs to be infused with a human rights-based education. Our budget, the municipal budget of Winnipeg, needs to be open, transparent. Budget allocation needs to be taking into consideration the needs of the community as a whole, with participation and transparency, not only in the distribution, but how the decisions are made on the distribution of all these things to have all these resources of all these different things. So I think it infuses everything, but it's only a single tool. And even if you can have a human rights city that declares itself a human rights city, but none of its policies or bylaws or programs mention the word human rights, or you can have a city that takes a human rights-based approach to all of its bylaws, plans, but then the reality on the ground is that it's completely different, right? So what always matters is, I think, the factual reality on the ground and how to bridge the aspirations of what we're looking for with the tools that we have to achieve those aspirations, and finding out where that disjunction between the theory and practice of what we're trying to achieve, and what are the obstacles there to us collectively achieving that, and can we remove those obstacles? That to me is what, and for me, I'm learning a lot about Winnipeg. I'm trying to do the fast track of reading policies and laws and the history, and so I can't really say where I think it is. I'm here to learn more about what's happened, what's come before, what has been tried, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and where power lays within the city. So I think that's my understanding.
Many thanks, Nathan. And Karen, I turn it to you. What, how would you define what we mean by a human rights city?
I think many of my reflections, really echo or build off of Nathan, what you've already said, and what others have reflected on already. Just picking up on your notion of, a city can proclaim itself as in identity terms as being a human rights city. I think that's very much where Winnipeg is, right? We had a museum go up, and we saw an opportunity to brand ourselves or to adopt human rights as sort of a municipal symbol or identity. But what we lack really is, the policy and legal infrastructure to hold ourselves accountable to what it means to be a human rights city. I'm really looking forward to, Joel, your reflections as it relates to that sort of concept and construct of a human rights city, and sort of in legal terms. But if I think about what does it mean to be a human rights city, I go back to that arcane document you referenced earlier, Joel, like the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, and it's 30 articles. And so for me, it would mean on the ground every day as I walk through my neighborhood, as I speak to my community members, that I'm seeing us exercise the notion that everyone has a right to life, liberty, and security, that certain inherent political and legal rights are being upheld, that we all have certain cultural, economic, and social rights, including the right to education, the right to healthcare, the right to a certain standard of living, that we have mechanisms to hold our governments and policymakers accountable when we see that the vision of that right and the place that we are at, that there's a distance or a gap between that, sort of as Nathan was referencing, and that as we embark upon developing laws and bylaws and policies, that we are holding ourselves to a standard built and premised around those 30 articles. So that's sort of what it means to me to be a human rights city. And I know we're going to get there, but the last week and so many experiences before that tell us that we are so far from realizing that vision, even though we've adopted this notion of ourselves as a human rights city. We've adopted an identity that, without the substance behind it, really. So that I look forward to, Joel, your comments on this construct of the human rights city, and what we can learn from you on that.
Thank you very much, Karen. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm seeing questions come in under the Q&A function, and we will absolutely be getting there. And after Joel speaks, I think I'm just going to read some of the questions out from the Q&A and then move on to one of the set questions. Joel, what are some of your thoughts about how you would define what we mean by a human rights city? And I do also want to say, Karen, I really appreciate what you're talking about in terms of the distance and the dissonance, and that's going to be where we're going kind of next. Joel, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. It's very challenging to go fifth behind 4 brilliant people who have said so many profound things. So I'll try to fill in some gaps, but I support and endorse so many things that have been said already. I mean, just to put maybe a sharper edge on one note is that the potential for a human rights city declaration, or more specifically, instrument, I think if this were to work, or where it works, or the areas in which it works, it develops mechanisms, bureaucratic mechanisms for sharpening the tools of government to get them to work for us. Because they're not designed to work for us, right? They're designed to protect privileged interests, and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I'll use one example. In San Francisco, California, they built out, as part of their Human Rights City Declaration, a gender equity office. You say, okay, what's another office? Well, that office has responsibilities, and it's staffed, I'm sure, by just a couple people, and every year it has to produce a report. Well, what do you have to do to produce a report? Well, you have to do research. You have to go to the people and gauge what their experience is in, for instance, the area of gender equity or whatever it might be. And so it's an effort to build institutional mechanisms that are codified, that are resourced, that is to say funded, right? That have responsibilities that get a community in the habit of asking these questions, going out into the community, particularly to people impacted by abuse in various areas, and say, how are things going for you? And then you put those experiences in a report, and yes, it's just another report, but it builds. It is another accountability, mechanism. It is an effort to get the government to work, in this way. And so, I just want to highlight that. And the other thing that I would say, is how a human rights approach, generally speaking, appeals to a higher authority, a global authority, right? And that allows both sort of to form and forge very specific sort of networks and links with other human rights cities internationally. This isn't a quite international movement. I don't just mean the US and Canada. I mean, there are dozens of human rights cities around the world. There had been, at least before the pandemic, international convenings around human rights cities. I literally think the last one was in Japan, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was in East Asia. And to build that sense that the laws in the place where you live, if they don't speak to you, if they don't speak to your experience, if they're not doing the work of improving your welfare and your dignity, well, there are higher authorities to make, higher authorities to appeal to, higher appeals to make. And that, I think, is really the power. So when we think about racial discrimination in the United States, why community activists go to the United Nations and make appeals for racial justice, is because the way we understand racial discrimination in the United States is quite so limited. It's quite so limited, so making that broader appeal, that international appeal, yes, it allows us to link and forge networks of solidarity and political action together, but also it helps to validate experience by saying, yes, what you are facing is real. And even though your local laws, your state laws, maybe even your federal laws are inadequate to validate your experience and offer a remedy, there are other places to go to pursue it. And so, yeah, so I would say that. Thank you.
Many thanks. And then the notion of accountability, right? The notion of accountability in structure and in action. I want to just take us time right now just to read some questions that have come up in the Q&A. Just to make sure that we are remembering we are engaged in a dialogue here and we are all learning. One is from Izzadeen Hawamda. How do we make human rights and advocacy more inclusive to address those that are most to address that those marginalized also marginalize others? So let me say that again. How do we make human rights and advocacy more inclusive to address that those who are marginalized also marginalize others? So that's one question. Another one coming from Queer Peg Project. I'm paraphrasing it, pardon me, just in sake of time. Winnipeg is a new home for immigrants and refugees. What is the role of human rights education in the right and responsibility to learn about Indigenous history and culture and to maintain our diverse communities? Promoting diversity isn't enough. What does inclusivity actually look like when we're speaking about human rights? So those are some questions that have come as well. As a human rights approach, there's a lot of response here in terms of a human rights approach in terms of policy and how do we incorporate human rights approach in terms of policy. I I feel like we are moving because of the questions coming from the audience and because of what people are saying. I feel like we are moving to the "and so now what" question. And so I'm going to open this up to the panelists. And so now what? What do we do with this? What are some actions and points of leverage? What are our responsibilities here? And what is needed to go forward in a good way? And I'm going to open up to whichever panelist wants to speak first, actually.
Can I jump in? I think
Go for it.
Thank you. I think as panelists, and I trust I do no harm in saying this, we have to hold ourselves accountable. You know, we're sitting here as panelists and we're saying, well, this is what we think, and this is what we think how we should move forward, but we have to hold ourselves accountable. That's the first and foremost. And I'll give an example. You know, I have the pleasure of teaching young minds every Tuesdays and Thursdays, although right now they are just hungry for their grades to be graded and stuff. So it's a bit of a struggle in academia at this time of the year, which I'm sure some of my colleagues will appreciate and understand the beautiful struggle. But you know, I had a really deep conversation with my my second year students yesterday, and not only keeping me accountable, but keeping them accountable after this class. Meaning, you know, we've talked about many themes. We've talked about social structure. We've talked about agency. We've talked about your racisms, which are plural, by the way. We've talked about you know, cultural competency. We've talked about intersectionality. We've talked about all these things. Now, how do you now hold yourself accountable for the future? Said to them, you know, there's going to be a day I'm going to get old. Don't cut off my pension. Don't cut my pension. I'm going to need my pension. Don't cut that. But in this, in the spirit of trying to be humorous and just trying to connect with their young minds, it's about getting them ready and prepared to take on this fight after us. And I think, you know, the accountability that I'm pointing, I think the accountability I'm pointing to, sorry, is ensuring that when we have these conversations, we're having it in a way that invites people in and lean into a learning moment. I also want to acknowledge the comments and questions that are in the chat. I had a moment to read through them, and there's a lot of vulnerability in there. A lot of people are sharing of self. So folks who've had the opportunity to share something, I speak on behalf of the panel. We appreciate you. Thank you for being vulnerable. And I think we have to, and we're seeing different people. We're seeing based on sexuality, gender, you know, race, you know, ethnicity. We're seeing it all. And I think to move this conversation forward is to actually acknowledge, you know, the oppressions that we've all been practicing for many years. Like, let's acknowledge that. And that's the white settler ideology thinking, which is, it's rampant in how we approach ourselves. It's rampant how we educate. It's rampant in how we view the world. I think we need to I'm going to be very strong in word here. We need to, you know, dismantle that. I wanted to say tear it down, but dismantle that. And we need to encourage appreciation for a multicultural approach and understanding development policies. This work has come out from scholars such as, you know, Dr. George Safadeh at U of T. You know, he's been talking about this. You know, there's scholars such as Carl James who are talking about this. Yet we're still using the same narratives to create policy that are oppressive. We're still encouraging the same way how we think that is inclusive, and coming with different catchwords or phrases to define people. We need to acknowledge that people are different. We need to acknowledge that people, you know, right now are at the margins of a lot of people. But one last thing I'll say, and I know I'm being long-winded, this is what academics do, folks. We talk, okay? So the last thing I'll say is that we have to acknowledge our privilege. You know, as much as I sit here and say I'm a Black man, I have more than that. I have privilege. I can sit here amongst brilliant people and speak with all of you. I can walk through a university door and go to my office. And we also have to acknowledge that there are people that are actually living, you know, the oppression every day. You know, they wake up and that's all they know. There are young people not living in homes. They're living in houses, literally, where they're going into these houses and there's no support because the ones who are their guardians didn't have support, don't know how to teach them that support. And that's not a shot at the guardians or parents, but that's just the reality. So we have to, I think, I encourage us to acknowledge those those privileges we have. Acknowledge the accountability comes from us too. And don't stop this conversation because the time stops. Continue having these conversations in any which way possible.
Thank you, Orna. You bring up an excellent point in terms of we can be both vulnerable and privileged at the same time. We can be both marginalized and privileged at the same time. And I just want to acknowledge that this notion of accountability and actionable change is coming up again and again and again in the chat. Kirby Cote writing, hello friends, I enter this conversation as a queer person with a disability. How do we at a community grassroots level hold persons in positions of power to create actionable change, including the voices of the vulnerable and the underserved community members? And this can become wasted labor if people in power are just listening. And so again, it comes down to that accountability. So I asked the panelists again, and so now what? And what can we do with this? What are some actions and points of leverage? What are our responsibilities here? Warren, you laid your perspective out very clearly in that, and what is needed to go forward in a good way. Who else would like to respond?
I can respond quickly then. I think there's 2 points I would make going forward. One is I think that we need to be inclusive and participate. Anything going forward needs to involve the individuals that will be most affected by all of the decisions and policies and programs that we want to make, not just by academics or people in the discussion. If we're talking about housing policy or equality and non-discrimination policy or education policy, all of those individuals there needs to be space created to hear all the voices that these policies and programs are going to implicate. Second, I think that we could call the government out of the municipality, say, hey, I'm not sure, you'll have to forgive my ignorance if the government is suggesting that it is a human rights city or monopolizing or leveraging on this idea or this identity. Call them out and say, if you want to identify as a human rights city and you're monopolizing this, or you're leveraging this for political purposes or social or economic purposes, let's see you put this into practice. Let's see you convene meetings with specific groups to hear their grievances, then to hear their suggestions for forward strategies on what individuals, communities, vulnerable groups want going forward, what they need going forward, not what you think is best or what's better for the city economically and balancing all the competing interests, but actually listen to the city, its inhabitants, and the people that make up the city, and then develop a strategy to go forward, involving those individuals that will implicate moving forward. Those are my 2 suggestions for 2 possibles out of a multiplicity of forward strategies.
Many thanks, Nathan. Karen, I see your hand up.
Thanks. Yeah, just hearing Warren and Nathan speak, I'm sort of going more off the cuff rather than my kind of prepared notes. But as I sort of take in all of your comments and reflect on the questions that are coming up in the Q&A, which are excellent, I wonder if what we need to go forward is actually to move beyond human rights in some ways. And I don't mean to complicate this or to take us away from the focus of today's session, but there are limitations to the framework of human rights. And I think we should be honest about those as well. And some of those, thanks for lowering my hand, Shana. Some of those limitations are in the ways that rights-based discourse and frameworks often get taken up sort of out of a preoccupation, and rightly so, because that's their roots of individualism. And we forget that with rights necessarily come responsibilities. And even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights talks about, a spirit of it uses the term brotherhood, but it talks about, recognition that you move forward in rights, in collaboration and in understanding of what your neighbor next to you needs, of that you are not in a silo, that you work in community, and that rights only come into existence so long as we each uphold them in our own ways for ourselves, and for each other. So I wonder if the future of ensuring that we all have the things we need to live good, meaningful lives in safety, in security, and in joy, depends upon us, emphasizing less what we deserve as individuals and more what we need to do for each other in relationship to one another. And I just to some of the comments or questions that are coming up in the Q&A about sort of what's the relationship between human rights and Indigenous rights. I just thought I would put out there that there's a really good discussion between the complicated and tension-filled relationship between these two sets of inherent rights in Canada in the MMIWG final report. And I think that there's so much in that report that directs us to a way forward, not just in terms of addressing the human rights crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and trans people, but also just in terms of how we live a good life and walk alongside each other in good ways going forward. So that report, I think, is just such a, even though in many ways we haven't seen the calls to action and the calls to justice implemented at a provincial or federal level in a meaningful way, I think it's just such an important resource that we all, if we think about our individual actions and collective actions coming out of today, return to help ground us in what it means to be a human rights city.
Many thanks, Karen, and absolutely, with rights comes responsibilities, and I'm actually thinking of a philosopher, Paniker, who says that when we talk about human rights and we talk about the self, we need to remember that the self is not an individual, but the self is our relationships, including our relationships to the land, our relationships to the family, our relationships to generations before, and our relationships to generations in the future. Warren, I saw your hand, but I do just want to open up to see if either Joel or Reanna wanted to speak regarding this question. In terms of, and so now what, what can we do with this? What are some actions and points of leverage? What are our responsibilities here? What is needed to go forward in a good way? If either of you have any thoughts, and then Warren, I'll come back with you.
Reanna, if I may, I think I have a note that would just connect, I think, very nicely with what Karen said, which is, localizing human rights doesn't mean taking an international document and, signing it, right? Like, what does it, like, how would you put in place a community process for understanding these international norms in local terms and in local contexts? And so what, I said, like, different cities use, for instance, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women locally. Well, what would it look like? And maybe there are communities somewhere doing this. What would it look like to use the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People locally, right? I mean, that is a sort of a new declaration within the human rights body of work that presumably, as someone who is neither Indigenous nor from your community, might have something to say to speak to your experience and frame it. And so, it's obviously it's so obvious to me as someone who is an outsider, the kind of grieving that your community is doing over recent incidents that are only the most recent incidents in a longer standing pattern of violence and discrimination and insecurity. And so what would it look like to foreground Indigenous rights in some local declaration that is rights-based, right, for all the reasons we've already discussed? So it shouldn't be cookie cutter, right? The hard work, of course, is getting people together and agreeing on things, but I mean, that process is community building too. And so maybe I just offer that. I mean, how do you make this yours, as a community, that it speaks to your experience, your populations, your needs?
Thank you, Joel. And actually, Vancouver has stated that they will be, putting forth the governance through UNDRIP. They have said this. we will see what actually happens. But that is one example. Reanna, did you unmute yourself?
Yep.
No. Okay, awesome.
Yeah. I feel a initial cause of action that I initially thought of was to impact all levels of society, but there also needs to be levels of impacting our education. And I think that that's a really root and foundational type of action in terms of how we impact our society to make human rights a priority or Indigenous rights a priority. And I really asked this question of how are we upbringing and educating young ones in elementary school, secondary school, post-secondary on Indigenous history and the experiences of Indigenous people. And there needs to be that in-depth type of integration within the curriculum and integrating human rights, Indigenous histories, and human rights movements. And these are all the stuff that Indigenous people have been vocalizing for a very long time, and all of the issues of MMIWG and 2S and the violence against women, the mistreatment of houseless relatives that we face, the land rematriation, unmarked graves, Idle No More, child and family services. And I really think that the list continues, goes on and on and on. And we've always made these types of calls to action, reports, and resources. And I really think that there needs to be that level of education for the people within our community. And we need to be realizing or asking this question of how are we acting upon really the common harmful narrative of Indigenous people. And there's a lot of these individuals that are placed within their city that are taught this harmful narrative, and then continue on and perpetuate racism and discrimination of Indigenous people, and people of color and two-spirited people and members of our community. And I really think that tackling that level of education would be a priority in my opinion. And from that type of education, we start to upbring and educate all these people that come up with in these levels of society to have that basic level of understanding and integration, and also type of action that they should have within our community. And I really see that these issues need to be everybody's responsibility. And that starts within education. And as Warren states, we have to have that level of accountability. And I feel like everybody has to have that level of accountability. And I really think it takes all levels of individuals to recognize this types of urgency. And that all starts with the aspect of education.
Many thanks, Reanna. And actually one of the first questions that were asked was by an anonymous attendee who was talking about working with Catherine Covell to develop a children's rights project, and looking at rights, respect, and responsibility, that was similar to something that was done in the UK. And this anonymous attendee also noted that education is the cornerstone of the community's value of human rights. How might we actually try and infuse this in Canadian and Manitoban school districts? So education policy, so very similar to what you were saying here. And I'm wondering, I'm just looking at the questions here, and Randy Gage is saying, please remember that seniors suffer from human rights abuses too, and remembering the importance of elders and seniors. I'm looking at the questions, and I'm wondering if now is a good time to just open up and see if there's some specific questions in the Q&A that you would like to be able to respond to, if that might be a good time to do that.
Do you mind if I respond?
Yeah, please.
Thank you. I'm here jumping in my seat because I want to say something. Sorry, I'm a talker. That's what academics we do, right, Nathan? There we go. It's a little humor. One of the things I want us to bring attention to, here's some good reading. This is my responsibility in keeping myself accountable and staying in my lane as an educator. If anybody heard the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, anybody heard that book? If you haven't read that book, I encourage you to please read that book. That's a gift from me to you folks at home. One of the things I'm going to draw from that book, Paulo Freire, who's the author of that book, he argues that you cannot fight oppression. You can't be anti-oppressive and be oppressive at the same time. It is impossible. Okay. And we also have to, when we consider the words of Freire, we also have to consider the intentionality. Because sometimes it's intent versus impact. Sometimes we think we're saying something, with the good intention, but the impact at times doesn't land with the goods we thought it does. And we have to be mindful of that. And I don't say what I'm about to say as a warning, but I say what I'm about to say as some, again, critical reflection on human rights. And that is, if we're not mindful of these type of conversations the way we're having them, we are going to bastardize the approach of human rights moving forward, meaning that it's already said in the word, it's human rights. It's not the rights of individuals first or certain groups first, it's human rights. And if we start going down the road of politicizing human rights, then we're going to do what Ferrer is urging us not to do, which is you cannot be anti-oppressive and oppressive at the same time. Sometimes the intentionality and it'll be unconscious of how we're doing things. And we have to be mindful that when we're talking about having these conversations, it is an inclusive conversation that we understand very much what, I'm sorry, I'm going to read, one of the people here in the chat said that we have to also pay attention that the elderly community is suffering a disservice, right? So we have to, and I encourage folks to please, let's be very critical and appreciative of what it says in human rights, which is the human first. We're all humans. And I think when we start, being very political, we're going against what Ferrer is arguing. And if we all appreciate that literature, we're going against what Ferrer is arguing not to do, which is you cannot be oppressive or anti-oppressive and oppressive at the same time. It does not work. So I want to acknowledge that. I want to say that, and I trust that it comes across with doing no harm. Thank you.
In terms of being political, I think that I'm hoping that we're making a distinction between political and policy. Is that correct? Okay, just want to make sure there. Okay, awesome. Thank you very much, Warren, and thank you for reminding us again the humanness as opposed to the individuality. I'm looking here at the Q&A. Are there other questions that people here, the panelists here, the discussants here, really would like to be able to address in some of in the Q&A? Is there anything that's speaking to you?
There's something speaking to me about that. I'm gonna reserve because I'm talking a lot.
Well, one of the things that I'm seeing, first of all, is over and over again talking about the notions of accountability and how do we actually hold governments accountable? What is it that is needed in order to hold governments accountable? And I'm wondering if anyone here would want to be able to speak to that. Please, Karen.
Maybe I'll just say I think we witnessed what that looks like over the past week. In all of us who watched the daughters and Indigenous leadership really stand up and demand that their loved ones be recovered over this past week, I think is a really tragic and violent example of what accountability can look like, right? Violent in the sense that I know it was reported over the last week, just the indignity of having to make that demand, right? But it is important that that we acknowledge that accountability, I think, is happening every day, and that communities are demanding different conditions, different policy, different choices from their governments, and there's so much work happening at the grassroots level, as evidenced this past week, and that takes I think that has an incredible emotional, financial toll on activist communities and rights holder communities who are doing that work. we see it, and I think we should honor it. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention it. But all of us, I think, have a role to play in making space for that work to happen, letting people with that direct lived experience demand what the conditions of their lives will look like, and what they expect from their governments in order for their rights to be upheld. And I just, you know, I think for me, for example, speaking personally, I have a job to uplift those voices and to say for my own part that accountability is important. It's not someone else's responsibility, but I need to play that supporting role. So that was what I thought of in that question. I'm sure others have thoughts as well.
Many thanks, Karen. And I'm you know, I want to take this time to basically thank everyone who has stayed. We had over 100 people attending this discussion. We have a really active chat going on right now in the Q&A. And I'm mindful of people's times. I'm mindful that people have taken 90 minutes out of their day in order to look at a computer screen. And I want to just take this time to say, is there any last words from the from the panelists, from the guests here that you'd like to say? Because I think that what we're talking about in terms of accountability, in terms of making space, in terms of action, in terms of listening, and in terms of also remembering that change can happen is a really powerful thing that many of you have addressed. Is there any last thing that any of you would like to be able to say before we wrap it up today? Please, Warren.
Thanks. I think this is an opportunity for people again to I trust people leading into a learning moment. I know there was a lot of questions. I'm reading the chat, and I'm sorry, that we don't have enough time. This is an awesome conversation, and I've learned so much from my co-panelists here. But whatever you receive from this is probably I trust it's an opportunity for you to pay it forward and continue this conversation. And maybe it could be a way to inspire some people who you're around. So I just want to at least leave folks with that, and I trust that this conversation does help in some way, and continue to think through critically on how we can make Winnipeg a human rights city.
Thank you, Reanna. Yeah.
And I guess I'll close with the last few notes or messages that I wanted to convey. And similar to Warren, that we need to be like challenging other people or holding other people accountable, but we need to also be like understanding that we need to, I'm coming from an Indigenous type of perspective as an Indigenous person, but we need to be able to be seen in all levels of society. A lot of the people are often blinded by a lot of the issues that are pertaining to Indigenous people, and we need to be seen as deserving of respect and dignity, and understanding the harsh realities that we are succumbed to as Indigenous people. As you mentioned, Shana, in the beginning, that we lost a relative that was on the streets that was succumbed to the cold temperatures and was found in a bus shelter. And within the comments there was like someone talking about the seniors. There's a lot of elders in our community that are subject to the harsh realities of and discrimination within the healthcare system. My own Kugum, like herself, whenever she comes in the city, she's sitting at a bus shelter waiting for transportation and resources for way too long within the healthcare system or within a hospital. She's not seen as a priority. And there's all those instances where a lot of northern communities and northern elders and individuals come within the city and succumb to all of those types of realities and racism and discrimination. And we aren't seen as people deserving of those types of respect. And this is my challenge to all these people that are visiting this now or that are non-Indigenous, to see us as human and see us as deserving of that type of respect. But also realize that we also deserve to be heard. because like I mentioned before, we always voice these types of issues, and we are not like, we should have our voice not only acknowledged, but heard and acted upon. And to also include us and within all of the discussions and narratives and conversations. And as Nathan mentioned, like have that participatory type of framework and include Indigenous people within that conversation. So I wanted to just end with that and making sure that understand that these issues has to become everybody's responsibility.
Many thanks, Reanna. Many thanks for reminding us that with rights comes responsibility, and it's not just to be seen and it's not just to be heard, but also to be acted with and in solidarity. I want to thank everybody here. I want to thank Reanna, Warren, Nathan, Karen, Joel, and once again, I want to thank Adele and Pauline, and to all of the people who have chosen to participate in the chat, in staying for a whole hour and a half online after 3 years of COVID, and also for ending this in a way with hope, as opposed to despair, with resolve that we will do better. And going back to even what Joel said at the beginning, that our future will look better than our present. And want to thank all of you, remind you that this will be available on the Center for Human Rights Research website. Please feel free to share it. It'll also be available on the Center for Social Science Research and Policy's website. Thank you very much. And I wish us all strength. And I really appreciate all the learning that took place today, and vulnerability and strength. Thank you.